Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Prince Podcast here on Podcast Juice. My name is Michael Dean, and joining me today, we've got a special guest. All the way from Australia, we have Marylou Badeaux. How are you doing, Marylou?
Yeah, hi. How are you?
I'm good. Did I say your last name correctly? Is it Badeaux?
You were very close. It's actually Badeaux.
Badeaux.
But you did better than most.
All right. In the book, you share a great insider's point of view of the listening party for, I won't say party, but the listening session at the executive table in regards to around the world in a day.
Yep.
And, I've heard that story from other points of view or in other books before, but to hear it the way you told it, can you tell us a little bit, just kind of walk us through a little bit of that? Because this is an interesting time to me. Obviously, the success of Purple Rain was phenomenal. It was just crazy. And the anticipation was super high for what the follow-up would be.
And that's the mistake the record company made, the word follow-up.
Okay. Well,
because, most artists, not most, but many artists will, and I use the word, when I say artist, I'm lopping probably a bunch of people into that probably don't really fit that term, but for the purposes of what we're talking about. If an artist has a record that starts to, really happen, as a rule, they build on that. And the next record will probably sort of carry on as far as, okay, we found the so-called formula, so we're going to sort of continue because that's what people want to hear, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. While with Prince, there is no such thing as follow-up. When he's done, he's done. And I mean, that had to do with sort of everything with him. It wasn't just music. It's just like, why are we revisiting something that already happened? And in this case, I mean, he'd climbed the mountain, for God's sake. What was he going to do? Look for a higher mountain? He was in it because of the passion for the music. He was in it because he had this gift, which, and I mention it in the book, sometimes that gift, I question whether it is a gift or something much worse, because it's stuff that's running through your head 24/7. You can't just turn it off. You and I and most people can't imagine what that is. In this case, he went totally in another direction, completely and totally. And the other thing, it wasn't a follow-up because he was recording it when he was out on the road, because, heaven forbid you only do a concert. I mean, like most human beings would do. He would do a concert, he would do after shows, he would go to the studio, shoot videos. I mean, he just had this ability to, you wind him up and he just goes, the epitome of the ever-ready battery. So he, for whatever reasons, and I don't know, went in this totally other direction, and people were in the room, really looking forward to the next big thing. And then suddenly, the music is obviously very different. And you could see the shifting in the room. You could see people like sort of their eyes going down, their eyes going up, body language, etc. And it's all from the standpoint, irrespective of how good it was musically, it was like, what do we do with this? And in his mind, that's our problem, because this is where he was at musically at that particular point in time. Wow.
Is there any sort of like, I think this was in the book, but I'm just curious, is this the presentation of him doing these songs like this and playing them for you, is that supposed to be like saying, hey, I want you to hear what I am presenting to you? Or is there some sort of situation where executives can be like, well, hey, I had some opinions about something, or I had some thoughts about something? Is that?
Well, excuse me. You didn't always have listening sessions for every record. I mean, that's all we'd ever be doing if that were the case. Sometimes it would be sort of a fancy thing because it's something that the artist and the people at the record company think are particularly, incredible, and they want to present it. Other times it's simply sent in by management to the department that starts doing the physical, setup of it. In many cases with Prince, many times it was simply delivered to Bo Austin by management or sometimes by Prince himself. I can't answer the question as far as why he would have decided he wanted to present this in person and play it. It's always an interesting thing when an artist comes in and has the entire album and people sit in a room and listen to the whole album. I think if I were an artist, I wouldn't want to do that because but see, as the artist, I would assume he just thought it was the most fabulous. I mean, I happen to love the album. And maybe he wanted to see the reaction of people. Maybe it was important to him that he be there in person because, hey, this isn't Purple Rain 2. I want you to see where I'm at this point. And then that way I can look at your reactions, because above and beyond what anybody might sense when they watch people listening to something, Prince had an uncanny sixth sense, uncanny. So he can really read people. And so he just sat there on the floor, legs crossed. Wendy and Lisa were with him. And I wasn't far. What he had asked for, and this is typical Prince, last minute, because it's like there's no like forward thinking as far as, oh, well, let's next week do a listening session. He would have his people call up at 9 o'clock in the morning and saying, okay, we're doing a listening session. We are coming in at 2 o'clock. So whatever else you got going on, you'll switch it. And we want the conference table taken out. We want the curtains drawn. We want the room to have this nice ambient feeling. And so, the company would make that happen. And in this case, he walked in with Wendy and Lisa. They were all in like silk pajamas. So I sort of thought, oh, they look like they're heading off to a pajama party, but whatever. And at that point, because what he had asked for was that the chairs, or they're actually in that room, there's these large couches that are along the wall. So they took out the chairs and the table. The couches were left, so some people were sitting in the couches, and then other people were sitting on the floor because there wasn't enough seating. And so I wasn't sitting, I was already on the floor when he came in, and he sat not far from me and just sort of nodded, acknowledged. And I watched him as this record was going on, and even though his head was down most of the time, he vibed the room. He knew what was going on. And what he did was just sort of a few bars from the end of the last cut, they just sort of magically got up and he walked out. Wow. And what that said to me was he wasn't happy with the response. He didn't want to get caught up in somebody coming up to him and saying something that he didn't want to hear. So he removed himself from the room.
Interesting. And I don't know if you mentioned it in this conversation here, but in the book you talk about when they walked in, they were sprinkling like not feathers, but
yes, I'm sorry, I forgot that part. With Wendy and Lisa, they were in their jammies, very nice ones, of course, silk and all that. Wendy and Lisa were throwing rose petals on the ground. Wow. So they had the lighting. It was sort of like a cocktail lounge. And, these big curtains that they had, because it was also a big screen. Well, at that time it was a projector, that we didn't have the flat screens then. So they have these blackout curtains. So the room, you could barely see in the room. But that was the vibe he wanted. So that's fine. They came in rose petals and all.
And I think it was his father was there too, as well?
I'm trying to remember. I think he might have been. I can't swear to it. I think I remember seeing him there that day. Yeah.
All right. Wow. Well, yeah, that was an interesting album. I remember, and what was interesting back then too is obviously there was no internet back then. So when you did get the opportunity to see an artist perform, it was a big deal because they weren't all over the place. And I remember at that time, it seemed that Prince kind of was gone for a little bit. All we had saw was Purple Rain, and then he comes back and it was I think it was that MTV interview where he was filming Under the Cherry Moon. He did that interview, and they did they performed America.
That's right. Yep.
And I'm not sure if that was when they world premiered. It might have, Raspberry Beret may have been out before that point, but we'd only seen Prince a few times, and there was the Raspberry Beret video, and he looked so different. And it was just like, wow, he looks totally different from the kid, right? We just imagined the kid imagery, and so then we see this, and that wasn't a big thing because you didn't see him as much, and when you did, he was totally different. It was already on something different.
Well, that's it. I mean, you couldn't keep up with him.
Yeah.
It's just, again, the nature of, I used to say to people, and I think I referred to it in the book, but in my mind, I always felt like he would look at me or anyone else, and he would feel like we were talking in slow motion because he was just so out there. He was on a different plane. I don't know how else to put it. And on one hand, it's very hard to understand because none of us are on that plane. There would be a handful. I mean, I would put Stevie Wonder in that kind of thing. I mean, there would be very, very few that would be where, they're just different. They're very, very different.
Definitely.